salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Welcome to our latest Rising Tide Ocean podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host is Vicki Nichols-Goldstein. And today, we're starting a new segment called Blue News You Can Use, the latest ocean news for dolphins, whales, and all ships at sea. Vicki, what have you got to report?
Well, this is so interesting. The FDA is looking at safety data for a variety of petrochemical sunscreen ingredients, including oxybenzone, avobenzone, and octocrylene. These ingredients have been shown to have adverse impacts on human health as endocrine disruptors and impact both the aquatic and ocean environment. We are all wondering about the future of U.S. sunscreens. Will the FDA ban all of these petrochemicals? Will mineral sunscreens be the only option for U.S. consumers? But in the meantime, go with mineral sunscreens and protect yourself and the environment.
Okay, well, that's a sticky subject. My news ain't great either. The LA Times just reported that scientists are concerned the Atlantic conveyor belt of ocean currents is weakening under the warming climate. If it collapses, that could throw world weather patterns into chaos, creating a new ice age for Europe. It'll roast the southern hemisphere. Well, here's my idea. Let's just speed up our transition off fossil fuels before it's literally hell and high water. Speaking of global challenges, coastal dead zones. The UN says they're growing, and our guest today is Dr. Nancy Rabalais from Louisiana State University. Nancy's been called the mother of dead zones, in that her research into hypoxia has helped define the Gulf of Mexico's seasonal no-go zones of oxygen-depleted waters generated by runoff from the Mississippi River that can and has grown to the size of New Jersey or larger. More recently, Nancy studied the long-term impacts of the BP oil spill on the Gulf, the relationship of ocean acidification and low oxygen. But before we get into your amazing work, Nancy, maybe we can start with how you first connected with the ocean. Does it go back to your youth in North Texas?
Well, it goes back to 8th grade love of biology. I lived in Corpus Christi at that time, and I didn't get introduced to the ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, until I was in high school and started learning how to scuba dive and getting under the water and just loving it, just absolutely loving it. My eventual research also involved scuba diving to put out oxygen meters, which is how I determine how the oxygen changes over very fine scales at limited locations.
How'd you get into studying oxygen levels in the water? That's something most new scuba divers don't immediately go to.
I chased fiddler crabs around South Texas in graduate school, and as I've often said, it did not prepare me for congressional testimony.
What are the basics for our audience of hypoxia, low oxygen, anoxia, no oxygen? How does it spread in the Gulf, and why is it so large down there?
Okay, there's two aspects to development of hypoxia. You need the physical structure of the water column, which separates layers of water and prevents the movement of oxygen from the surface to the bottom. There's also the biology, which is the stimulus of phytoplankton by nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. Their growth, they're feeding the food web, flux of fecal pellets from zooplankton feeding, or just flux of dead diatoms, ends up providing a lot of organic matter to the bottom that's decomposed by bacteria that are aerobic, like you and I. We use up oxygen and produce carbon dioxide, and the bacteria can take up the oxygen at a much faster rate than it can be resupplied across this physical barrier that's developed by the salinity and the temperature differences.
So that means that the nutrients are running down the Gulf of Mexico. It's like the synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that are growing more algae than is needed, and that's what goes down and sinks and gets eaten and sucks the oxygen out.
As is often said, it's too much of a good thing. The fertilizers, of course, are used for agriculture. They grow crops. We don't necessarily feed the world. We feed a lot of hogs and chickens and cows and the U.S. Geological Survey has done the accounting on where the nitrogen comes from and the activities from which they come. Over 70% is from agricultural-based activities.
So, Nancy, I live in Colorado, which is the part of the largest watershed in the country, the Mississippi River watershed or Mississippi-Missouri watershed, and it drains over 1 million square miles from all parts of the 31 states and Canadian provinces, stretching from the Rockies to the Appalachians. So I think what we're talking about is this enormous landmass that people really don't understand how all of those tributaries, those creeks, those rivers, it's all washing in to the Gulf of Mexico. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on the landmass and all the activities that are happening there and how that gets into the Gulf of Mexico.
I often think of the Mississippi River coastal Gulf of Mexico as one continuous ecosystem, with the land-based activities affecting the Gulf and Gulf-based activities affecting the land. Probably a third of the rainfall in the Midwest comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and the Mississippi River itself is a world-class river, and it drains a huge area, as you mentioned, Montana to New York, even into Canada. It just covers a huge area, and most of that area, or a lot of that area, is in agriculture or rangeland, and that facilitates the movement of the nitrogen and the phosphorus off the land. There are best management practices that can be applied that can reduce the nitrogen moving through the soil and under the soil and into the nearest stream and eventually into the Gulf of Mexico, but those haven't been adopted by the greater agricultural community, which is really an agribusiness.
It seems like it's just an enormous problem to manage these pollution flows and how it's really going to take so many different levels of effort to really keep those materials on the land as opposed to letting them flow into the waterways and eventually into the Gulf of Mexico.
I see it as a political social issue because of legislation that promotes different types of agriculture as opposed to more conservative or conservation-oriented agriculture. I can see it as a social issue because one farmer probably won't do something that's more acceptable for the resources until his or her neighbor does the same thing. Mm-hmm. So there's a social aspect and a political aspect.
When your reports first started coming out 30 years ago, saying there's this big dead zone on the Gulf and it's impacting fisheries and the fishing industry, you got a lot of negative feedback from agriculture, from the Farm Bureau, and sort of attack the messenger. But you've always been willing to go upriver and talk to farmers and agricultural groups. And I wonder over time if your reception has changed.
The reception can sometimes be very similar, unfortunately, but there are more individuals in that part of the Corn Belt in the Midwest that understand the issues. And the Midwest has its own water quality problems with high nitrate in drinking water, harmful algal blooms that are toxic, and you just can't go swimming in reservoirs because it's pea green with toxic cyanobacteria, and nitrate levels and blue baby syndrome in drinking waters. And some cities have to put on tertiary treatment, which is much more expensive because of the high nitrate loads, and the producers of those nitrate loads are not paying for that water quality. The citizens of the cities that use the water are paying for that improved water quality.
I've heard and seen many photos of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Can you give us a description from your experience what a dead zone really looks like when you're underwater?
We dive in our research operation to put oxygen meters on an offshore platform that are cabled, so we get real-time data, continuous every 15 seconds from the bottom and the middle and the surface. To do that, we have to dive in those instruments and then take out the used ones and swap out. I have some video. It shows that at the surface, the water is sometimes clear, sometimes turbid, with a lot of phytoplankton, and the color is very green. And there are many fish swimming around in that area, and many barnacles and anemones and other kinds of organisms growing on the side of the platform ledge. Lots of fish. Sports fisherman's paradise, Louisiana. Once you get below that level and the oxygen starts to drop down, you don't see any more fish. When you get to the bottom, it's sometimes very dark and murky. Sometimes it's clear, but it's usually dark and murky. And there are no living organisms in the sediments. There are no living organisms on the side of the platform, which can look like a mini coral reef at times at the surface. And you definitely know you're in the area of the low oxygen, the dead zone.
Dead animals? I mean, or are there just like no animals?
There are no animals, but we've done a lot of remotely operated vehicle work where we've had cameras down on the bottom with oxygen sensors to tell us what's there or not there, depending on the oxygen level. And those activities have shown us that there are dead animals on the bottom, not a whole lot. And if they're not dead, they're dying because they're up out of their burrows, trying to reach oxygen in some way. You see brittle stars, sea stars that get up on their legs and try to reach higher oxygen. You see shrimp swimming above the bottom, which is not where they belong because that means they're going to be eaten by something. You can just see organisms trying to reach oxygen, and there's no oxygen there. And many of those will eventually die off.
And this goes on for hundreds of miles. This isn't just localized.
Yes, our favorite comparison is the size of the state of New Jersey, from the Mississippi River over onto the Texas coast and even into Texas at times. And that particular size comparison proved very worthwhile when the former governor of New Jersey addressed the National Academy group on nutrient pollution. And she said, in no uncertain terms, I don't want to hear this thing compared to the size of the state of New Jersey anymore. and I thought she was looking directly at me. But then a couple years later, I went to a retirement party for somebody from the Office of Water at EPA who had done a lot of work on nutrient reductions. And she was there. And I walked up to her and shook her hand and said, Nancy Rabalais, dead zone, Gulf of Mexico, size of the state of New Jersey. And she was taken aback. And that's when she helped move the hypoxia action plan for nutrient reductions from a Bush desk onto a Clinton desk. And we started making some progress.
So New Jersey actually came through in this particular case.
Okay, a quick break here. I'm sure you recognize my voice. I'm your co-host, David Helvarg. I'm also executive director of Blue Frontier that sponsors Rising Tide. If you enjoy our talks with the watermen and women making a difference for our ocean world, you might also want to check out our other work at www.bluefront.org. There you'll find links to many other projects, including our Blue Movement directory of over 1,200 ocean activist organizations, many near you. Again, check us out at bluefront.org. And if you enjoy Rising Tide, the Ocean podcast, spread the word to friends and families from sea to shining sea. And now, back to the show.
I'm actually quite a timid person.
So timid but brave. You talk about the platforms. Those are the oil platforms in the Gulf. The Gulf's not a quiet little body of water. You've had to duck your research vessels between the platforms to escape hurricane type situations, waves. I remember after Hurricane Katrina, you were diving, and about 40 feet down, you touched something living. Tell us that story.
There was an alligator in the surface waters that had been displaced by Hurricane Katrina from its nice, safe swamps into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. And it kept going down a little bit and coming back up. And my dive buddy was just totally freaked out. And I said, he's not a diving alligator. It's just an alligator. And so we're just going to get our work done. And then, of course, we couldn't see anyway. And he was just petrified. And I'm so comfortable in the water, it didn't bother me. But there was that alligator when we came back up. Same thing when we came back up under an oil spill after the Deepwater Horizon. That was not a nice situation.
So you came up right into surface oil.
Right. I had my crew with me. The water was pea green, a lot of algae to me. And they said, no, this is the oil spill. And I said, no, it's algae. And I convinced one person to get in the water with me. And it was algae. You got below it. There was no oil at the time. But when we got through doing our work, we surfaced under an oil slick.
So better to be swimming with dolphins or even a displaced alligator than rigging BP oil.
Nancy, you mentioned you came up under oil. What kind of work have you been doing with oil spills?
My first oil spill was in Port Aransas, Texas in the 1970s, and we followed that in a Spartina mangrove marsh. Then the big one was, of course, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, in which our research partners banded together and wrote a proposal to the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative that was funded by BP, but was independent of BP. And we studied marsh ecosystems and the effects of the oil over about a 10-year period. And it was an incredible experience with so many types of scientists, from people who worked on loons and sparrows in the marsh to periwinkles on the blades of the seagrasses. And, we covered everything, microbial communities. And we found, besides the immediate damage, with the long-term funding, we found that many of the communities had still not recovered after 9 years.
When you were looking at the impacts, Nancy, did you find that the dispersant use was a beneficial or a harmful practice with dealing with oil spills?
That's still a controversial subject, but the National Academies has done a report on the dispersant and did not find any more toxic effects that combined with the oil than just the oil itself. The use of the dispersant was to keep the oil from reaching the shoreline, which was a management decision made by the BP Command Center, or the Deepwater Horizon Command Center. And they just felt like dispersing the oil was better than it getting into the wetlands and the seagrass beds.
I covered the BP spill in 2010. I remember flying over a pod of 100 dolphins and a humpback whale trapped and dying in the oil. All these years later, are the large mammals like the dolphins still impacted by the effects of the spill?
They are. One of the long-term effects has been the health of bottlenose dolphins in the area, with lesions and strandings, and newborns that are just not making it.
With the situations with, the sargassum, with oil spills, with dead zones, how does the situation of climate change affect all of these topics, whether it's the duration, the size, the frequency of the zones, or
right.
the sargassum? How do you factor that in when you're dealing with all of these issues?
Right. Well, the change in the offshore ecosystem was primarily from the 1950s, with an acceleration since the 1970s. And that's a long time. The climate change is even slower, and that's an even longer time. It's difficult to get the data, at least from the Gulf of Mexico, that shows major changes. We do see an increase in the bottom water temperature in the area where the low oxygen forms. There is less oxygen in higher temperatures than there are in colder temperatures. So that's a factor there. The analyses so far have predicted wetter winters and springs in the upper Midwest, earlier snowmelt, which would send more water and nutrients into the Gulf of Mexico, which would aggravate the low oxygen situation. There are also predictions of higher water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico was roaring hot last summer. It was really high. And those types of changes will strengthen the difference in those layers in the water column. and be more of a barrier to oxygen moving from the surface to the bottom. They're also predicted to cause more hurricanes, which we don't want, but that does alleviate the low oxygen, at least for a little while, and then it will step back up.
So hotter waters like that 101 degrees that the Florida Keys hit last summer.
I can't think in Fahrenheit, but our Celsius temperatures were well above 30 and 31. It's just like bath water out there.
So you're having these incredible marine heat waves, and that affects the nutrients in the dead zone. And also another climate impact is the acidification of the ocean as it absorbs more and more carbon dioxide. How does that interact with your dead zones? A more hotter, more acidic ocean seems to hold less oxygen.
The surface waters in the Gulf have increased in carbon dioxide, probably not to the extent that it's acidic. The bottom water, the oxygen uptake and the production of CO2 by the respiration of the bacteria generate lower pH values in the bottom waters. You can see it. They go hand in hand. Lower oxygen, lower pH, and more acidic waters. The organisms that live in that layer will be affected by acidification.
I wanted to get a bigger picture since we're talking about dead zones. How many dead zones do we have in the United States, and about how many do we have in the world? I mean, we've been focusing on the Gulf of Mexico, but give us a bigger picture.
The world number has been tracked very closely by researchers Bob Diaz and Rutger Rosenberg over the years. The current count is about 500. They're mostly off of larger rivers that have excess nutrients coming into the ocean. Don't know the count in the U.S., but every state and every estuary probably has incidences of low oxygen now that they did not have before.
That's incredible.
The number has definitely increased over time for those that are influenced by human activities in their related watersheds. There's no doubt about that.
So, and how is the climate funding under the Biden administration? Is there enough money to do the research out in the Gulf, the research that's needed and to inform policy?
Our research dollars are being squeezed right now. And we think it's an incredibly long-term database that needs to be continued because it's the way we're going to tell whether we're making any improvement in the watershed nutrient loads. There's so many demands on public funds that sometimes natural resources just do not get enough. And I think the Gulf of Mexico has always been one of those areas, and the science in the Gulf of Mexico is going to suffer as more and more budgets that support oceanic research are cut back.
And what do you feel are, for your research personally, what are some of your most pressing research questions and challenges that you really are addressing now and in your immediate future?
One of the issues, of course, is the effects of climate, and you need long-term data to see those trends. But the effects of climate, I think, are going to be very important, not only to the low oxygen in the bottom waters, but to the overall productivity of the Mississippi River landscape continuous ecosystem. It's going to be a major impact, and it's going to happen slowly. We're not going to get kicked in the side of the head and say, oh, why didn't I think of that yesterday? It's going to be something that's going to happen slowly and incipiently.
That is for sure. I'd like to know, what you've been doing this for so long, what gives you hope for the future?
It's hope. I mean, I really do have an optimistic way of looking at this long-term issue, even though it has not gotten better. It's not gotten worse now. It's leveled off, but it's not gotten better. And that's going to take people who understand the issue and people like me who keep taking the talks up into the Midwest and giving them, and working with science museums in the Midwest to have low oxygen displays. And it's public education is one way to get to a better informed electorate. And it's difficult to convince somebody that's 1,000 miles away that they're linked to the Gulf of Mexico. And people in the Gulf of Mexico think that they're linked with the Midwest. We've had some outreach activities that involve farmers bringing steaks to Cocodrie, which is at the end of the road, right next to the Terrebonne Bay, and shrimpers bringing shrimp up to the Midwest to have shrimp boils. And they get together and they talk and they see there's similar problems with production and cost of fuel and all the same things. That's how we're gonna make the difference, is through better education, I think, and people who are more likely to listen to the science-based evidence.
I think this is why Vicki founded the Inland Ocean Coalition, because those farmers and those fishermen are connected. And when you have real solid science voices like yours, those connections become more obvious, that we're all dependent on our ocean.
Nancy, it's been really a delight. Dr. Nancy Rabalais talking with us about the land-to-sea connection, the dead zones, and maintaining hope for the future. So thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been my pleasure as well.
Excellent.
Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by Blue Frontier's David Helvarg and Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with production support from Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, Natasha Benjamin, and Nick Paz, and editing services provided by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May. You can find Rising Tide at bluefront.org or on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcast. And don't forget to recommend the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast to your friends and other ocean lovers.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.